turnout. How many of you saw me here a couple of months ago talking about the moon? Maybe a few? Okay, so there'll be just a little bit of reprise of that, but I'm really here tonight to talk about the broader context. So I'm going to cover the types of things that we might do in space with human spaceflight. And it's a little broader, it's actually quite a bit broader than most of the discussions that you typically hear. And so I'm opening with an image here that I want to just dwell on for a second to explain what it is. So what you see here is the Earth-Moon system to scale, right? So that's us and that's the moon. And it's unique in the solar system. We have, except for Pluto and Charon, which is also a double planet system. This is the only double planet system in our solar system. What that means for humans in space is that there is another planet, a planet-size object, effectively like Venus, Mercury, Mars, and the Earth. It's what used to be called a telluric planet, a rocky planet, that has as much surface area as the continent of Africa. And it's 3 days away. So we'll come back and talk about why that might be relevant a little bit later. It's relevant in particular for the types of things we might do, and it's relevant for the scale of activities that are affordable given the resources that we and other spacefaring nations have. So if this advances, okay, good. So I can juggle all my devices here. All right, so what is human spaceflight? So it depends maybe on what generation you're from. I was born the same year as NASA. So next year I'll be 60, and I've seen all of these generations come and go, and some that haven't really even come yet over here. But depending on who you ask, what it means to have humans in space at all may be different. So it could be planting flags and making footprints. It could be living continuously and performing scientific experiments. It could be getting back and forth. This is the Soyuz system. And it could be passenger travel as that's coming into reality. And it may be exploring even farther away in cislunar space and then on to Mars. It may be, some of you may have seen Elon Musk's talk recently that he gave just in Australia a few weeks ago, about very large-scale human transportation in space and what that might mean. So we're going to talk about several of these things. Human spaceflight maybe could be or is all of these things. But this is what I think most of us mean human spaceflight to be. So certainly this is why I got into the field in the 60s when I was growing up. We all knew this was the future. And by the way, that was the future only in 2001, which is now ancient history. And so you could envision settlements on the moon. You could envision colonies on Mars. How many of you know what this is? Oh, Fhloston Paradise, good. So this is from Fifth Element. We can envision cruise ships in space as well. And we're going to talk about all of that. I would argue that there is an enormous gap. There has always been, and there still is, and there will be for a long time, a huge gap between what human spaceflight is and can be given our resources today and what we dream it ought to be in the future. So, as maybe my bio indicated, I've been in this field a long time. I was at Boeing for 17 years, and I've been at JPL now for 13 years. And in all the talks I've heard at conferences and all the reading I've done, there are only four sources of all the visions for what human spaceflight might be. And so I encapsulate them as you see on this chart. You can explore, which means going someplace nobody's ever been. You can exploit, which means extracting something of value from someplace. You can experience it, which means just being there, being able literally to write home about it. And you can expand. You can expand the front of human settlement into some new place. And so we can maybe talk in the jam if anybody thinks there's something that somebody has suggested about human spaceflight that isn't one or more of these things. I don't think there are any others. But these are all extremely different from each other. And so I'm going to encourage you tonight to think about that and what that means. So we'll start a little bit with Explore. I'm not going to talk about it a lot because NASA has talked about it for 60 years. And so I'm going to talk more about things that NASA does not talk about. But let's just think a little bit about what it means to explore. So I argue that the Explorer vision, I'll call it, is literally about extending human presence where we've never been. Okay, this phrase itself you recognize. It originated in 1965, the year that Star Trek was being designed. It was on the air in 1966. And that was in parallel with the Apollo program. So this was the vision that most of us grew up with for what space exploration means. You might argue that the hero is Captain Kirk, or the hero is Neil Armstrong, or maybe the astronauts of today. But the template, certainly in the United States for exploration, is Lewis and Clark, which is why I use that picture to illustrate it on the previous chart. These are government employees who are chartered to go to some part of our domain and find out what's there and report back. Okay, that's what exploration is all about. Well, so how do you do it in space? First of all, as you've heard in Sydney's talk, to explore really in our consciousness means to go to Mars, because it is the farthest place we can imagine actually going with humans. And so if you take, I always do things in big round numbers. This is $100 billion, which could be $200 or $500 billion, but it's 10 to the 11th dollars, and you take a bunch of decades, then you can do this, right? This is what NASA has been planning and talking about for many, many years. Here's how you do it. You need very large, that is human scale, space flight vehicles to operate in deep space. You have to sustain the soft pink thing inside and the systems that keep them alive for many years, billions of kilometers from home, where there is no help to get them fixed. You have to land stuff on Mars that's at least 25 times bigger and heavier than anything we've demonstrated an ability to do so far. You have to figure out how to use local resources, as we've just been hearing, and avoid contaminating places where life might be, because Mars is somewhat unique in it used to have clement conditions billions of years ago. There may still be places deep in the subsurface, for example, where it's conceivable that life could have evolved and survived. But if you spend this money over this amount of time, that amount of money over that amount of time, and you invest it in these things, then you get a half a dozen civil servants on Mars once. Okay? So, and because this has been a persistent dream in our modern society, that's a critical value proposition to appreciate, because it really would be a remarkable accomplishment, right? Those of us that work in the field maybe appreciate just how remarkable it would be, because it's really hard to make it happen. But that is the value proposition. So I'm going to use this same pattern to think about alternative futures for human spaceflight. So think about that. A bunch of civil servants planting a flag, being on Mars once or maybe a couple of times, that money, that time. Okay? So let's talk about one of the other quadrants, the experience future. This is a very different vision. This is not 6 people on Mars. This is hundreds of thousands of people like us, maybe a little bit richer than us, traveling in space every year. Now, they're traveling in space. It doesn't mean they're going to Mars, but it means they're in space. What do you do in space? Well, you have the ride of your life, right? It takes 8 minutes to get up into orbit. It takes about a half an hour to get back down from orbit. When you're in microgravity, you have this unique experience which really cannot be replicated in a sustained way anywhere on Earth. You can't experience it any other way. You get to play with your food and have zero-G sex and all those fun things. And you look out the window and the view of the planet is the most amazing, ever-changing, beautiful, poignant view in the entire solar system. So that's the experience. I think that's marketable. Maybe some of you do too. Maybe some of you would like to experience that. The cultural myth that underlies this is the jet set, right? People who can write a check or use a credit card, get in a vehicle, go someplace and do something fun for vacation, for example, right? And the modern template for this, I think, is Richard Branson. Somebody who wants to do it, somebody who is working toward it, owns companies that take people to destinations, right? So there's kind of a pattern already established, and you can think of Richard Branson as emblematic of this vision. Well, so here's the remarkable thing. If you spent the same amount of money and the same amount of time as on the previous chart, but you invested in a bunch of different things, you could enable this vision. And you begin to see why this vision is not interchangeable with the previous one. For this one, you need what we call 5 nines reliability and reusable flight vehicles. So most of you wouldn't really, when you go and you lay down a credit card to get a flight on Air France to Paris, it's because you think you're going to get there, right? And so you wouldn't go on a 2-week vacation in low Earth orbit if you weren't pretty sure that it was going to work and you're going to be okay and you're going to be able to come back home and actually do some different kind of vacation the following year or the following decade. And this is not what we are investing in today, just to be clear. You also need a whole bunch of hardware that we do not know how to do, right? We have never figured out yet, we've never demonstrated or tested or even really developed designs for how to build large volumes in space. So I used to work with an amazing configuration designer who said that we were squeezing the entire US space program through a 15-foot diameter. And that's effectively what we do with rockets. But if you're going to have large numbers of people in space, you need to have places where they can assemble, just like we're doing here. You need to build big volumes for that. You have to do that in space. We don't know how to do that. Big windows are a real problem. That's why all windows in space vehicles are very small. We don't have what I call kitchen science. We do not cook in space. We heat up food from a freezer. So I argue you can't have a hotel in space until you can mix a martini and make an omelet. Nobody knows how to do that. We're not even experimenting with it. And leisure facilities, swimming pools, and concert halls and so forth, and artificial gravity, which is a fascinating engineering challenge. It's something that NASA runs away screaming in the other direction from. And you would need something that we also don't have and don't really think about, which is a cadre of workers whose job it is to be in space and do things in space for others who are passengers or travelers, right? So all of these things are different and they're not cheap, but if you invested what I argue is about the same amount of money and same amount of time, then you get all these things. So along the way, by the way, you get 1 hour intercontinental travel, right? It takes 90 minutes to go around the Earth. So if you launch in Florida and go to, let's just say, Singapore, it takes about 45 minutes to get there. You would have a whole plethora of new travel-related industries, just like we do because of air travel today. That's all new since air travel originated in the early 20th century. And you would expand what Frank White calls the overview effect. That is this psychological impact of being able to look out over the Earth and see it as one place, the only place that's habitable in the solar system, without borders, et cetera, et cetera. That is very impactful on all 500 of the astronauts that have flown to date. And you can imagine what might begin to happen if that effect were extended to hundreds of thousands of ordinary people every year. Very different vision of human spaceflight in the future. So the next quadrant is exploitation, okay, and that means natural resources. I'm only going to talk tonight primarily about one resource which is the easiest one to extract from space because it weighs nothing, and that is photons. The picture I use for this is what we call a rectenna. That's a receiving antenna for microwave power beamed from space. This one is about 10 kilometers across. And if you look carefully, you see that one of the interesting things about this particular use of space for Earth is that you can plant crops underneath it. So cows and corn and all kinds of things that we do already today with land use can be done underneath one of these microwave receiving antennas. Why am I talking about receiving microwaves? Okay, so little detour here. Everybody knows a 40-watt light bulb. If it's burning all the time, we're going to call that 1 unit. It's about a kilowatt hour per day. We're just going to call that 1 unit, okay? And everybody in this room uses about 200 of those units per day, right? American standard of living. Well, if you got that energy not by digging up carbon out of the ground and burning it and putting it in the atmosphere like we do today, but if you got it from renewable sources, then there are impacts, planetary scale impacts. And this is an example of the area that would be required if you essentially paved half of Texas with solar arrays. Then you could support the American standard of living, today's standard of living, for a population about 3 times the size of ours here in the US. So in the United States, this isn't a problem. We could pave over half of Texas, I'm sure they'd let us. And that's kind of relatively easy, right? It's more of a problem for Europe because you have to do it in Africa because that's where the sun is. And then you need fail-operable, very secure intercontinental high-voltage transmission lines to get the power from there to there. That might be actually a boon for the Spanish economy, which could use it right now, and maybe for the Italian economy as well, because that's where you'd put the lines. But this is just an example of how it gets complicated around the rest of the world, far more complicated than just an America First kind of view of this type of solution. High voltage power lines across oceans that have to work no matter what because civilization depends on them. It sounds like a target for terrorism to me. And then if you, this is just say 2 of these areas, so that's 2 billion people. There are already 7 billion people on the planet, more coming, obviously. And if you want to increase the standard of living of everybody on the planet to the standard of living that we enjoy, you begin to see the planetary scale impacts of doing this with renewable sources. It's what I call macro engineering at the scale of the planet. Well, there's another way to do it. There's actually 3 other ways to do it. One is by having enormous kelp farms in the ocean, which will probably happen. Another is with nuclear power, which will probably happen. And the third, the only other one, is to get power from space. So here's a diagram of a device, a machine, a satellite, that would be in geostationary orbit. It's big. There it is, 4 kilometers across. So this is really big scale. You know, robots build this thing and maintain it and all that. And this sends down enough power to this antenna we looked at before, which is about the same size as the campus of Cal Poly Pomona. And that replaces 1 gigawatt nuclear power plant. So the geostationary orbit, which today is already industrialized for reconnaissance, Earth observation, weather, and telecommunications, could be industrialized for the production of unlimited amounts of energy for use on Earth. And you say, what does that have to do with human spaceflight? And the answer is actually pretty straightforward. It's because this is vast infrastructure. If you replace all of the Earth's future energy needs as far as we could see, it would require building an area, an equivalent area in geostationary orbit that's about equivalent to the surface area of the US National Highway System. So it's a lot of area. So you build it with robots, a lot of launches, a lot of robots. Somebody has to go kick the robots every now and then. And so there is probably a need for hundreds to thousands of space workers, even to enable a highly robotic future like this. So this is the exploit vision. Enable a non-disruptive transition to a post-petroleum civilization. That's a fancy way of saying getting past oil without everything breaking down and having world wars, by opening unlimited energy resources for use by Earth. This is the use of space for Earth. It's not exploration, it's not experience, it's exploitation. Same amount of money, same amount of time, but very different stuff. You need a lot of heavy lift launch capacity that, oh, by the way, can't ruin the atmosphere. So there are restrictions on the type of propellant you could use. These new types of space systems that are very lightweight, advanced robotics at an enormous implementation scale. But if you did this, then you would achieve this future. So there's a value proposition for you. That future, for the same amount of money and same amount of time, we're currently investing on trying to get 6 people to Mars once. So the fourth one is expanding. So here's the moon. It's kind of nasty, really. It's really bright for 2 weeks at a time, and then it's really dark for 2 weeks at a time. It's hot and then cold. It's really dry. If you get the dust from the regolith in the air that you're breathing, you get silicosis in your lungs. So it's not altogether a fabulous place, not your vacation spot as you might envision it. So why would we care to expand humanity to a place like this? All right, so my first graduate degree is in architecture, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of preposterousness from the history of architecture. And the point is that cities grow in places that you wouldn't necessarily choose if you were being rational about it. This is an example of the ancient city of Ubar on the Arabian Peninsula. It was a crossroad of trade routes, and then because they built it over top of karst terrain, which is limestone caverns that have been eroded by rain over many thousands of years, they didn't know that's what it was. So one day it collapsed into a cavern and disappeared. Here's Machu Picchu in Peru. This was an education city, a university city for the Inca Empire. It was purposely built in the valley adjacent to the sacred valley of the Incas, far downriver. It takes days of hiking to get there. Why would you put a city there? And it turns out this was the place where the children of conquered rulers were indoctrinated into Inca philosophy. So they became Incans here. And this city was put here on purpose so that it could never be found by attackers. And in fact, it wasn't found until early in the 20th century. This is Akrotiri here in the Mediterranean. This was a Minoan civilization 1,000 years before the Greeks. And they unfortunately built it on what was a volcano that exploded one day. This may have given rise to the myth of Atlantis. And here we are building Santorini right on the same volcano. In the US, we have a history of building cities in swamps. I've lived in both of these places, Houston and Washington, D.C. No matter what you hear, nobody's draining either of these swamps, right? Nature has a way. We also build cities below sea level here and in Europe, as you know. Here's where we are right now. Those of you who may have been here in 2009, this is the station fire. So my house is kind of like right there. We're very close to here. But why would you put a city here? There's no water, really, right? We get all of our water from someplace else, and there's earthquakes all the time, and there's fires, and what a horrible place for a city. And then here's one that's probably even worse. It's much smaller, but it's up on the north slope of Alaska. It's really nasty up there. Okay, so this one gives you a clue about why cities are built in these weird places, right? Cities always are built, and only are built, where there's an economic value to be had by having a collection of people together. So it can be trade routes, it can be natural resources. It's actually normally those two things. And so the point of all this is to say that just because you look at a place and it's desolate, right? Buzz Aldrin's phrase, magnificent desolation. looking at the moon when he's standing there. Just because it looks horrible doesn't mean that it's not a place that humanity might expand to in some future time. So what is the expansion vision? Well, it's about settling off-world, establishing Earth life and human civilization in some place that becomes or can be independent of our home world. So that's fundamentally different from exploring or exploiting or merely experiencing, right? This is expansion. This is going to stay. And so the cultural myth is the pioneer, covered wagons, you know, all that sort of thing. My favorite template for this is Heinlein novels. Those of you who like Robert Heinlein stories, you know, there's the scrappy guy who's kind of on both sides of the law and, you know, has a history, and he's got a babe on his arm, and he's, you know, getting in and out of trouble. And so, but what is the context for all that? It's settling in some place. It's establishing normal human life in some alien place. Well, guess what? Same amount of money, same amount of time, but you invest in different things and you get this vision. What do you need? If you're going to settle space, you build a railroad, right? The other way is to send Adam and Eve, but that takes a really long time, and they have to be really good at in situ resource utilization. And you have to do genuine civil engineering in spaceflight systems and in alien locations with harsh environments. You need community scale life support. This does not mean warehouses full of tubes and pumps and filters and things that break like on space station. This means plants, right? Because that's how you support large populations. The broadest spectrum of daily stuff, you know, the things that you do every day are what would need to be done if you're going to actually enable settlement in space. And of course, you have to learn to live off the land and extract resources, not just for your use, but for export. If you're not exporting, there's no economic engine. You won't build a city there. Nobody will. But if it turns out that this could be done, say, on the moon, then you end up with hundreds of people raising families in space and actually learning how humanity can live in some place that's not Earth. Really live in some place that's not Earth. All right, so now I want to talk just a bit about what it all costs, because this is the wet blanket part of the visions. Okay, so space station, the most amazing technological peacetime achievement in human history, I would argue. About $100 billion and about 40 years. Does that sound familiar? It's really four things. It's a power system, it's a bunch of labs, it's some HABs, and it's an Earth to orbit and return to Earth transportation capability. We use the Russian systems now, we used to use the shuttle. It's just those four things. All right, let's imagine doing it on the moon. What the Director General of the European Space Agency, Jan Werner, calls a moon village. Well, you need lunar versions of the same four things, right? And you need a whole other four things. You got to get back and forth to the moon, you got to get down to the surface and back up, you got to have all this civil engineering capability, and you need to learn how to use resources. So if anybody tries to tell you that this thing is cheaper than this thing, don't believe it. Even if the lunar versions of this stuff is, say, a 50% discount compared to what it cost us the first time, it's still tens of billions and a long time to develop. As Sydney just showed you, these things, there's a lot that goes into trying to figure this out. How to do it, where to do it, what not to do, what technologies to use, and then there's all the stuff that we've never done, except for Apollo a little bit. And so it is for this reason more than any other that when you hear people arguing about should we go back to the moon or should we go to Mars, this is why the moon will win. At the end of the day, the dollars tell you the answer. Because as hard as it is to do this at the moon, and as expensive as it is compared to what we just did over the last 3 decades in Earth orbit, it's way harder and more expensive to do it for Mars. So guess which one's going to get done first? Okay, so how do you connect these futures? Is there a way to connect these futures? Because you may have favorites. Maybe some of you want to go explore. with 6 civil servants. Maybe some of you want to go experience it on a 2-week honeymoon. Maybe some of you think we the party in power and go live someplace. All right, so how do you connect the dots? All right, now, so this is, it may feel like wet blanket at the beginning, but it's really not. So at the bottom, this is government investment. This is public money, tax dollars, okay? And at the top, this is commercial investment, private money. So I will argue that in the half century of human spaceflight that we have just done, we've done 2 things, which is we developed spaceflight and we demonstrated that we could live in space, okay? I know that's a little reductionist, but bear with me. What NASA's investing in now is extending those 2 things out to the distance of the moon, okay, in a sustainable way. That's what they call cislunar space. And why are they doing that? It's because they really want to go explore the solar system with flags and footprints and people. And what we're going to find, I predict, what I just explained on the previous chart, is that that's a bridge too far. Really, really big step. And that's the dilemma or that's the puzzle, the problem that has led to all these generations of concepts for how to go to Mars, right? So it did start in the 50s with von Braun. I personally lived in my professional life through 3 generations of us not getting to Mars. And it's because of this problem. It's harder and more expensive than people who just toss sound bites around want to believe. But look at what else has been happening. Now you have people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson who are developing with their money commercial space passenger travel based on technologies that NASA invented. That's a pretty cool thing. That's a good use of your tax dollars, right? Now, if you take the next step and you have guys like Robert Bigelow developing habitation systems, again, based on technologies that NASA has invented, and you put these 2 things together, you start to have infrastructure which is privately funded in space. That's kind of exciting. Now, there's yet another fork on this roadmap, and that is you could, for the cost, about the same cost as the value of the mission that my team just won last year to send a robotic mission to the metal asteroid Psyche, $500 million, you could demonstrate end-to-end power production from geostationary orbit to delivery into the grid on Earth. $500 million. If you did that, I believe that you would start to attract the attention of people who have money which is not the NASA budget. And then a public-private partnership could work together to demonstrate the really big step there, which is how do you scale up from a demonstration level to something which is industrial scale, which is what it would take to actually bring power down from space. And if that worked, then you extend the industrialization of the geostationary orbit from telecommunications and observation to power production. Once you do that, you have heavy lift launch, you have routine in-space operations, you have advanced robotics, and you're operating in an energy-rich environment in space. Then you can do whatever you want. You could go explore the solar system, you could settle the moon, you could do all of these things. So the question I think to pose is, what ought to come first if we want to open all of the futures in space? We have to be careful what we invest in, because while you're investing towards something, there may be, and there is, in fact, an opportunity cost for not investing in the other things that you're not investing in, which may foreclose or delay those other futures. So my fundamental argument is that we need to stop looking at places in space like the way we've always seen them, which is just some dusty, boring place there where we've been there and done that, right? And start looking at them as having the potential to open up these other futures, maybe with resources. The moon is a very interesting place in the context of these 4 visions for human spaceflight, because of all the places that you might invest toward with human spaceflight, it's the only one that can touch all 4 of the visions, right? You can imagine going on a vacation to the moon. That's a stretch, but it's not that much of a stretch. You can imagine establishing a settlement there once we learn how to extract ice from the poles of the moon. You can imagine using ice at the poles of the moon as a resource for the benefit of space industry, which in turn can benefit Earth. And there's certainly lots left to explore. So one other thing about this, well, to me, I guess the irony is that maybe to really expand humanity into space and to expand human spaceflight, we need to look back inward at Earth. We need to take a new view of Earth from space. And so this is it's probably hard to read in the back, but this is a diagram of all the population centers of the world today projected up to the geostationary orbit. So if you're a satellite in geo and you're providing telecommunications or clean energy, here are your customers. And one of the things I find remarkable about this is who are neighbors in that future. So Chicago and San Salvador, Lagos and London, Moscow and Jerusalem. And it's because of where they are when you map them out into the geostationary orbit. So I call this the geography of the future. This is a different view of today's societies based on where their sources of energy could be in the future if we invested in that. If you're in the geostationary orbit, this is what Earth looks like. Imagine holding a soccer ball at arm's length. That's the size of that view when you're in geo. Not a bad view. Very special place in the solar system. So my point tonight is to encourage you, since you pay for NASA every April 15th, to think very hard about what you want your space program to do for you and for us and for the planet and for the future and for your kids. What value proposition to you makes the most sense for $100 billion in 40 years worth of investment? And you can have it all, you just can't have it all at once. You need to put things in a proper sequence, and you can open up all these futures. I'll stop there and take questions.